first guest tonight.
Turns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Breakthrough.
And this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm Eugene Perrier. I am here with my co-host, Rania Khalek. There's a lot going on here. We apologize. It took us a second to start, so I just want to jump directly into the show. We're going to be spending the whole show talking about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine between Russia, Ukraine, and also NATO. Very happy to be joined as we continue the show here by Norman Solomon, who's the co-founder and national director of rootsaction.org. Also the author, I might add, of a great book, War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death. Norman, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Glad to be with you.
Well, one of the things I wanted to start with is listening to President Biden's speech, also seeing what Prime Minister Boris Johnson said earlier today, is they are essentially saying that what we've seen Russia going into Ukraine shows that diplomacy never could have worked, that everything that was previously discussed about NATO and enlargement was all just a canard. It would have happened anyway. So anyone sort of pushing for peace and diplomacy was deluded and is deluded now. So I want to just ask your opinion on that. I mean, do you think it's correct to not only close off diplomacy and peace in the future, but to say that nothing could have potentially prevented this on the diplomatic side?
That whole analysis is completely wrong. It's a way to demolish historical facts and point the finger 100% at Russia. And let me say at the outset, what Russia is doing in Ukraine is completely wrong. Anytime a country crosses a border and starts to kill people, it should be condemned. We have a big problem here where the entire history of NATO in the last 30 years is to expand up to Russia's borders. And so when the head of the British and US government say, oh, that was no, never mind, you have to wonder how they would like it if a foreign aligned power, let's say a alliance that is aligned with, say, Russia, would ship arms to an aligned government in Ireland or in Canada or in Mexico. I mean, it would be tolerated for about 2 seconds. It would be totally denounced and there would be all sorts of brinkmanship. But so a lot of this is in the category of do as we say, not as we do. And as I've traveled around the world, I've found that that's not very convincing to people, to be told that the United States should tell them how to behave. And there's one standard for the US and one standard for other countries. And it does not in any way excuse what Russia is doing now in Ukraine, which is horrific, to observe at the same time that for the USA, after invading Afghanistan, invading Iraq, and intervening in many other countries militarily with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, at least in the center as a result, it's not convincing for the US to get on its high horse.
I think that's very, very true. That's not convincing. And I think for a lot of people in the U.S., the question now is what to do, really. I mean, how to avoid pouring gas on the fire and how to be effective. I'm curious what you think about, what we've seen from the U.S. government, which is a drastic escalation of sanctions, more troops being sent to other parts of Europe. I mean, is that just pouring gas on the fire at this point? And if not, what are some of the off-ramps here that the U.S. at least should be trying to promote?
Yeah, President Biden has announced more troops will be going to Germany. He says not to intervene inside of Ukraine, but quote unquote to defend the NATO countries. One of the main problems with NATO is that it's never been about defense, certainly not in the last 30 years, as people in Libya and Afghanistan and Kosovo can attest. What we can do now, if we as people in the United States, is to organize, to analyze, and to push in a way that is demanding that our government finally engage in genuine diplomacy. And Eugene, that goes to your question a minute ago, which is that, yes, diplomacy could have averted this. And the fact is that NATO's expansion has been central to this conflict. There's a lot of denial out there. There are a lot of people, and as you noted, in high places and in media, the United States saying, oh, this was not about NATO expansion. It is about, has been about NATO expansion. Boris Yeltsin, who was basically a flunky for the US government as president of Russia in the 1990s, he was denouncing the NATO expansion. Of course, Putin has been doing the same. And so it gets us down to the fact that excluding the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO was always off the table in these last few months. And the leadership, such as it is of NATO, President Biden, they continue to say, as Biden did at a news conference a few weeks ago, oh, it's up to a sovereign government to decide whether to join NATO. He insisted that it was still a possibility that Ukraine would join NATO, which has always been absolutely unacceptable to Russia for basic security reasons. Not to belabor the point, but if the Warsaw Pact 40 years ago had been able to ship weapons in and build an alliance with the Canadian or Mexican government, the Washington-based government would have said, this is absolutely unacceptable. So we can't have two standards of human rights. We can't have two standards of international conduct and expect that's going to get us anywhere.
And I think that's the one thing that's people have been pointing out is there's a certain level of hypocrisy here, actually a huge level of hypocrisy here, because you have a lot of moralizing from leaders of countries that are responsible for so many bombing campaigns and wars, some of which that are ongoing right now. I mean, just in the last, I think, 24 hours, you had the US bombing Somalia, you had Yemen being bombed, you had Syria being bombed by the Israelis. Yet, you know, there's never any focus on these places. What do you think, you know, do you think there's something to be said about the fact that when we talk about international law, which is being brought up a lot right now in the context of Russia invading Ukraine, do you think there's something to be said about how international law has been treated for the last 30 or so years by the countries now denouncing Russia?
It's been international law has been completely cast aside and denigrated and ignored by the U.S. government. The U.S., unfortunately, has intervened in so many nations around the world directly, as well as right now, people are dying in Yemen because the Saudi-led alliance is continuing to bomb and create a huge humanitarian disaster. And the Biden administration has approved sales of billions of dollars more of weaponry to Saudi Arabia, going back on a campaign promise, by the way, of Biden. So there's a direct killing and intervention by the U.S. military. And then there's the less direct and the arms sales that are involved. And one of the things that is rarely, if ever, mentioned in the U.S. media is that when NATO was expanded to almost a dozen countries after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. was able to sell $17 billion, and that's with a B, $17 billion worth of weapons to the new members of NATO in Eastern Europe. This is a money thing. This is a corporate capitalist thing. And unfortunately, there is now an analogy, a big one, between Russia and the United States conflict and World War I. You know, we hear a lot about Munich and World War II, which is really not a good analogy. The best analogy is you have what was called at the time the war between the traders, Traders, the U.S. bloc and Germany of World War I. These were capitalist powers that were in conflict. And let's be clear, Russia is run by a bunch of capitalists and oligarchs and kleptocrats. And so we have a fight between two imperial powers at this point. But I do ask a question, and this in no way lets Russia off the hook for the horrible military actions going on now in Ukraine as we speak. But in this century, has the U.S. government or the Russian government killed more people in foreign interventions? And, you know, vastly, it is the U.S. that's been slaughtering people in one country after another. And, of course, we need to understand and analyze, and at the same time, what do we do about it? And a lot of that does require organizing. And speaking for rootsaction.org, where I work with many of my colleagues, we have set up a website which we invite everybody to go to for information and organizing and action. We've got to pressure our government to defuse the situation as much as possible. And that is nowarinUkraine.org. That's nowarinUkraine.org. And a lot of what the corporate media do, along with conveniently ignoring history that shows the U.S. with major culpability for this horrible crisis, the corporate media really make this into a spectator sport that we're watching and we're absorbing, and it's just some sort of, I don't know, news entertainment, and the ratings go up on the major cable networks. That's not what making history is about. That's like consuming history like a deadly Wonder Bread off the shelf. What we have to do is change history in real time, and that's about organizing and insisting that what Dr. Martin Luther King called the madness of militarism has to end.
Well, Norman, I think that point is very well taken, and a point we try to make to people all the time. Don't just watch, you can do something, and action is critical, I think, at this point. Apologies for starting a little late, but we really appreciate you being willing to give us some time. Norman Solomon of rootsaction.org, and you have the site nowarinUkraine.org, I believe, where you're also doing work. But thank you so much for joining us, Norman.
Hey, thank you both.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I just want to push forward here, and we'll come back around in a second on some of the details of what are going on. But we do have some great guests here, so be prepared to hit the share button and let folks know from a lot of different perspectives. So I just want to keep pushing forward here. And we're very happy to be joined us a couple weeks ago, Dr. Oleg Barabanov, who's a program director at the Valdai Discussion Club and a professor with the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Barabanov, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
As you might imagine, I think that the question being asked, by many people in the United States is what the motivation is for Russia's actions in Ukraine. And I was hoping you could shed some light from your perspective about what's going on here.
Yeah, in fact, I totally agree with your previous expert, with Norman, because it's really a clash of two imperialist powers. Because we have the U.S. imperialism for years and decades with all those wars from Vietnam and so on. And it's clear that anti-imperialist struggle, meaning anti-U.S. government struggle, is a good thing for the left forces, for the left-wing experts, and so on. But there is the question, because Russia also is raising against the U.S. imperialism. That's for sure, that's true, that's the fact. But if we can see the nature of the Russian political regime, the nature of the Russian political elite, we can also see that they are also imperialist. They are revisionist imperialists. They are trying to reverse the imperialist order built by the United States. But they are planning more or less the same. So I agree that it's a kind of a new First World War, not the Second World War, but the First World War, the clash between imperialists. And I remember from the Marxist theory, the quote from Vladimir Lenin said during exactly the First World War, let's turn the imperialistic war into a civil war. So I think that's the main aim of all freedom forces, of all left forces. In fact, to attract the attention of their respective governments, that not to follow imperialist logic, but to follow logic of freedom. Unfortunately, in Russia, the voice of the left forces is not big, frankly speaking. Sure, we had today the protests in Moscow, anti-war protests. in Moscow and in some other cities. But the major part of these protests are, let's say, pro-imperialist hipsters, the young middle class who want to go to the US, to the European Union to spend dollars and euro and nothing more. And now sanctions block them this opportunity. So that's the problem.
You know, I've seen in various forums different sort of polling saying, you know, anywhere between 50% and 70% of Russians are generally supportive of the recognition of the Donetsk and the Luhansk republics, but, you know, maybe a smaller number, but a similar, maybe slim majority in support of these actions. I mean, for people in Russia who do think Putin is right, what is their thought process? What are people? What's their view of what's happening in eastern Ukraine and why they would support something like this?
In fact, for me, there are two different things. The legal recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic and the military campaign 2 days after. Because for the recognition, we have this conflict for 8 years because the anti-imperialist, that's for sure, anti-imperialist uprising of Donetsk and Lugansk people started in April, May 2014. It was just from the beginning based on the real left theory. They were at the first weeks, first months of their existence, more or less, let's say, like Rojava, like the Kurdish autonomy at the north of Syria, who are also much connected to the left-wing theory. So it was a kind of people state based on not totally Marxist, but at least left theory. This is one thing. A good thing from our leftist point of view. Another thing, there is a nostalgia for the common country, which is quite strong for Russia, and the people there are ethnically mainly Russians, not Ukrainians. They speak Russian, not Ukrainian. Their identity is more Russian than Ukrainian. And in that sense, to these things, ethnic solidarity, historical nostalgic feelings, and also some sympathy to the left struggle based from the beginning of the initial leaders of the People's Republics. So that could be the factors for.
Oleg, I'm curious about something that a lot of people have been a bit puzzled by. You know, a lot of people were watching the US make these claims over the last several weeks that they had intelligence that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine. And even the Russian government was laughing at these claims and they were giving very specific times. And now we get to this point where it actually did happen. We're watching it happen. So from the Russian government's point of view, what is the end game, right? Because, okay, yes, Russia has invaded. There's a bombing campaign taking place. And obviously, you know, they've said it's because of, you know, they felt they were backed into a corner over the issue of NATO expansion, seeing Ukraine in the Western sphere of influence as a security threat. But now what's the end game here? What does the Russian government want out of this? Because that's still a bit unclear as far as we can tell.
Well, there are several possible options. Sure, I don't have the information from Vladimir Putin personally. I don't know, but logically, what he was saying about. The one thing is what he said as what he defined as demilitarization of Ukraine. So, and we've seen today that the major part of Russian airstrikes was focused on military airports, was military ammunition depots, armaments depots, and some other some other military bases of Ukraine. So in that sense, also putting it into the context of NATO enlargement, military aid from United States and UK to Ukraine, this could be one thing to block the Ukrainian military potential and to remove the threat for the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. This is one logic, just to bomb and stop. Another logic is to either, I try to use the word, either provoke or support the regime change within Ukraine. We understand it's much more ambitious task than a simple set of airstrikes. And for this thing, if Putin is planning exactly the regime change or something similar, it would be very important for him to work politically with some Ukrainian counter-elite leaders and something like this. There is the third option, the division of Ukraine. Many people speak about this because Ukraine, if you can see just on Wikipedia, the results of every Ukrainian elections, starting from 1991 until now, there is a clear division within the country between the west and the east of Ukraine. And it corresponds to two different identities, two different set of values. And in that sense, the division of Ukraine, the eastern part with more or less pro-Russian government, and the western part left into the NATO orbit, but without military potential, would be another option. But all this, I repeat, is just speculations that you can see in the Russian press, in some foreign press as well. So only time will tell us what will happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, time is going to reveal a lot, hopefully, in the context of this. But we've got a lot here on the show, and I apologize we started a little late. But thank you for sticking with us, Dr. Barabanov. Really happy to have you back here and giving us some of your time on the freedom side.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Rania, sorry here. I'm just trying to make sure I have my notes correct, but just trying to pick up a little time. So if you don't mind, I will continue to press forward here with our guests.
Yes, let's do it.
I just don't want you to think that I'm silencing you. Very happy to have with us now Ivan Katchanovski, who is a political scientist at the University of Ottawa from Ukraine. Professor, I'm sorry if I got your name wrong there as well. My apologies.
That's correct. That's fine. This is actually Ukrainian. So yeah, this is fast.
Well done, Eugene.
Well, thank you so much. And, there's so much here, Professor, I think, to try to understand. I mean, as someone told me earlier, if you just set the clock back 2 days, you won't really have a lot of understanding of what's happening. You had a recent piece that I thought was very important in Canadian Dimension, discussing the importance of what took place in 2014 in setting the political stage for our current events. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit here and help people maybe understand that, because I think the sort of broader context since the Maidan incident to now is so poorly understood in the United States.
I think this was a very important event and directly related to current war, which just happened after Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is actually was possible to prevent, I think, and I wrote this piece specifically trying to raise this issue, trying to suggest possible peaceful resolution of this conflict, which could have not been possible to do without actually understanding who started this conflict, which is now escalated to such dangerous level, and it will be, again, very problematic for the future of Ukraine, and I became very pessimistic about future of Ukraine. And I think this goes back to the Maidan Massacre, which took place 8 years ago in downtown Kiev, and the very heart of Kiev city, which is capital of Ukraine. And this massacre led to a violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government, which was relatively pro-Russian one, and the president of then Ukraine Viktor Yanukovych fled to Russia after this massacre and after several assassinations attempts against him. And this led to basically a change of the government and to subsequent Russian response in the form of annexation of Russian Crimea region in southern Ukraine, and also led to a civil war in Donbass and to Russian military interventions in Donbass in 2014 in August, and also in winter 2015. And now this is basically escalated to its ultimate and very dangerous for Ukraine and for the world, a war between Russia and Ukraine. And so the question was, who was actually responsible for this massacre, which was so important, not only because it was a major crime, which led to many people killed, but also led to such very important political events which go beyond Ukraine in terms of their significance. And I did research about this issue for a very long time. I specialize in politics of Ukraine, in conflicts in Ukraine, and in political violence. And I presented variety of papers and published peer-reviewed articles on this topic. And I can say now that based on this research and based on the evidence which was revealed by the Maidan Massacre trial and investigation in Ukraine, it's now possible to say without any doubt that this massacre of the Maidan protesters and the police was perpetrated with involvement of the oligarchic elements, or basically with the involvement of the Maidan opposition, in particular oligarchic parties and far-right organizations, which did this also with support of foreign snipers from Georgia, and there are also reports of snipers from Baltic states. And this was done specifically, basically, to do a regime change in Ukraine, to change not only government, but also to change basically politics and geopolitical orientation of Ukraine. And this is actually why this is so important. And mainstream media basically did not report about this evidence. And I just saw recently CNN, post-CNN correspondent who went to Ukraine and again was posting on Twitter about this massacre and basically saying this was Yanukovych government responsible for this mass killing and so on. Even so, all the evidence is available, including videos which were filmed by CNN itself. So I found videos by CNN. I did all the video analysis, and videos by CNN show far-right group of snipers going to the Maidan, just to the front of the Maidan stage, and massacring and starting shooting at the police. And after police fled, they went also to Hotel Ukraina, which was controlled by the Maidan forces, and along with other snipers, they shot at the Maidan protesters. And they did this specifically in order to blame the government, forces. And now there are testimonies of the absolute majority of wounded Maidan protesters who testified at the Ukrainian Maidan massacre trial and investigation that they were shot not by the police who are charged with this massacre, not by the government snipers, but they were shot from the locations which were controlled by the Maidan forces, in particular the Hotel Ukraina and other buildings which were at the time under control of the Maidan forces. And this is very important. This is not only testimonies of wounded protesters, there are admissions by 14 members of Maidan sniper groups. They admitted doing this. Some of them admitted shooting police, but others admitted that they shot also Maidan protesters on orders from the Maidan leadership, or from the orders from the Maidan opposition. And this also supported by videos of the massacre which analyzed and synchronized. And if we put all the videos of the massacre according to their timeline and according to precise sequence based on the sound from the Maidan stage, it's possible to see actually that Becker policemen who are charged with the massacre of the Maidan protesters, they did not massacre them because the times and directions of their gunshots, which they made at the time of the massacre, did not coincide with specific times and directions from which Maidan protesters were killed or wounded. There's few exceptions which are not certain, but because there were also gunshots from other directions, so it's not possible to say decisively. But in this case, this video evidence actually, which was presented as the most definite evidence to blame the government forces, actually it shows the opposite, that they did not massacre Maidan protesters. And I also found a video by Belgian television, which was most widely shown video segment in the entire world. It was shown on all the mainstream televisions in all the countries. I examined this video footage from major television networks in the United States, from Canada, from France, from Germany, Poland, and Ukraine. It was shown many, many times. And what they did not show, I got this full footage from the Belgian television, public television, because it was revealed by the Maidan Massacre trial. And this footage basically shows that Maidan protesters were led to this area when they were massacred. They were led specifically to be massacred by other Maidan protesters, and they noticed snipers shooting into them, into their group from the back, from the Hotel Ukraina, and they would turn back and ask snipers in the Hotel Ukraina not to shoot them. And this is important because government investigation simply denies that there were any snipers in these locations. They say there is no such evidence. Even so, they initially also publicly stated that there were snipers in the Hotel Ukraina, that they massacred Maidan protesters. So this is just such evidence which is clear. There is a variety of other evidence, including forensic medical examinations, which show that Maidan protesters were shot from the back or from the side, not from the front, and that almost all of them were shot from very steep direction, from which would be consistent with buildings and not from horizontal direction in which that was the location of the police.
You know, I'm curious, Ivan, when we obviously what you're talking about is very important, and the mainstream media in the West, as you've noted, has largely ignored or omitted everything that you just described. So many people are unaware of all of what you just explained. But that said, you know, when we talk about Ukraine now, Zelensky came to power promoting a reduction in the anti-Russian rhetoric of the people that you're talking about, and a kind of peace in the Ukrainian civil war with Russia. So what happened? Why didn't that work?
I think one of the reasons also is directly related to the Maidan massacre, because initially Zelensky wanted to investigate this massacre, and he also promised peace in Donbass, to end this war in Donbass. And he was very critical of the policy of Poroshenko, who was basically elected as one of the leaders of Maidan opposition. So Zelensky promised to do all this, but after he was elected, he basically stopped doing this. He never did anything of what he promised in this regard. And I think the reason for this, one of the major reasons for this, is he was afraid that he would have the same kind of fate that former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, had because of the Maidan massacre, or that he would be basically overthrown by alliance of far-right organizations, which became very powerful in Ukraine, and also by the oligarchic politicians, in particular Poroshenko and other ones who were also very powerful after the Maidan. So he changed his policy. He basically tried to replicate policies by Poroshenko, even going much further, much more radical, much more nationalistic policies. And this was also one of the reasons why he decided not only to kind of continue policies of Poroshenko, but he also tried to even go back on Minsk agreements and not to end war in Donbass. And this is actually now had also such kind of consequence, because Russia used this as a reason, or kind of as a pretext to kind of launch attack on Ukraine.
You know, I think what you're saying is so important because, I mean, to some degree, it almost feels like there is a certain inevitability to it. You know, obviously you have the NATO expansion, then you have the Western countries support this event in 2014, and then in the internal politics of Ukraine, as you're mentioning, you know, there's no implementation of peace because of the alliance of forces who want to avoid. I mean, of course, nothing is inevitable, but and there are probably many things that could have been done by the West and others to avoid this, but it does almost seem that the policies of the West of being so against Russia at all cost, even to supporting what happened in 2014 and trying to cover it up, it really did make it very difficult to have an outcome different than this.
This is also one of the major problems which are also I think, very unfortunate for Ukraine, because Western governments, in particular the US government, treated Ukraine as a tool against Russia. So this was their only basically major concern. They were not concerned about democracy in Ukraine. They supported policies which were undemocratic, in particular the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, because it was relatively pro-Russian and did not want to sign association agreement with the European Union. And basically this was done with support of the Western governments. And there is also interesting information which was revealed by two Ukrainian journalists in their book. They published interviews with far-right politicians who were also leaders of some of the leaders of Maidan opposition, and they wrote or they stated in their interviews to these Maidan journalists in Ukraine that before the massacre, a few weeks before the massacre took place, they met with some Western representative, Western government representative, and they discussed basically when Western government would be able to turn on Yanukovych, basically to go against him. And response was that there were debate. Basically, Western representative told them that few people is not sufficient to be killed among Maidan protesters is necessary, and they discussed if 20. They said also 20 is not sufficient, but 100 people who would be casualties would be sufficient. Then Western governments would change their policy and recognition of the Yanukovych government. And this is what happened immediately after the Maidan massacre. The Maidan opposition and the media and activists declared heavenly 100. Even so, there was not exactly 100 protesters killed, but they specifically emphasized this number. And this led to immediate change of the policy of Western governments. They basically blame Yanukovych immediately. And even Joe Biden, in his memoirs, book of memoirs, he said that he called then president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, and told him to basically leave not only his position as president of Ukraine, but also to leave Ukraine in entirety, and blaming for him for the Maidan massacre. And this was an example of basically kind of clear case when there was a very kind of strange policy in this regard, because it kind of looks very strange that Western governments would not have information about who actually was responsible for this massacre. So I believe that they knew about this massacre, but they did not care, or they actually encouraged in some kind of way, given, for instance, such kind of incentives. And this continued afterwards because Western governments also supported use of military force in Donbass, and they treated Ukraine as a client state, basically giving instructions for Ukrainian government officials whom to appoint, for instance, as Prime Minister of Ukraine. And Biden did this when he was vice president in the Obama administration, and this also continued later. They discussed whom to appoint in different government positions, including Prosecutor General in Ukraine. And Biden also admitted this publicly, and he boasted actually about this kind of interference very openly, saying that he told Poroshenko to replace Prosecutor General, head of the Prosecutor General office in Ukraine, and he gave him, I think, something like 24 hours. And this is continued, and this also led to policies basically supported by the West. And all of this was done not because they cared about Ukraine or Ukrainians. Actually, this was not consideration at all, because the main kind of view of Ukraine by the West and Western politicians was as a very useful and valuable tool against Russia. So that's why all the policies basically by the Western governments were dictated to use Ukraine as a tool against Russia. And this, I think, also continues right now, because it was possible to peacefully resolve this conflict. Just for instance, giving Ukraine a neutral status, or saying that Ukraine would not be admitted into NATO, because in any case, Ukraine, there was no such real possibility for Ukraine to be admitted in NATO. But Western states did not even want to discuss this, and Zelensky, who depended on Western support, government support, he also believed that kind of this is not a possibility to kind of abandon or even to discuss. And now we face a situation when actually Ukraine would very likely would have not only no NATO membership, but would have a totally different government, which would be likely to be pro-Russian and would be basically suffer very significant damage as a result of this war, and it will be a kind of very negative consequences for Ukraine and Ukrainians, which could have been easily prevented. But I think this was not in the interest of Western governments. Even so, it was kind of also very strange because there was a recent experience of Afghanistan disaster for the West. And I think a similar might happen situation with Ukraine, which would be also very negative effect on the kind of Western policy towards Ukraine and other states, which are also used for such purposes.
And then, lastly, I'm curious, just from your viewpoint, what do you think are Putin's ultimate goals in Ukraine? And I know this is kind of a guessing game because no one's 100% certain, but do you think that Putin wants to replace Zelensky's government with a more friendly one? Do you think this will end just at degrading Ukraine's military capacity? I know predictions haven't been great throughout this entire situation, but what is your prediction? And do you think there is still an opportunity to de-escalate at all?
I wrote also in my Canadian Dimension article and other interviews which I gave to Canadian television, networks, for instance, to media, also American op-ed, which I wrote in US media on, I think, February 16. I wrote actually that Putin's goal was either to try to pressure Ukraine into a peaceful deal on his preferred terms, like no NATO membership and no Western weapons and Western military in Ukraine, or he would resort to some kind of use of military force, including recognition of independence of separatist republics and deployment of Russian military force in this separatist controlled part of Donbass, or he would resort to even more extreme options like armed conflict with Ukraine, in particular use of missiles and bombardment of military installations or Ukraine, and taking over seizing control over part of Ukraine, in particular southern and eastern regions of Ukraine, or even to full-scale war. And in this case, what we can see now that in this that scenario which is happening is very closest to the one which was kind of most dangerous one, and it is most closest to kind of full-scale war. And because Russia launched not only bombardment of military installations in Ukraine, but also used military forces, and they are now very close to Kyiv, capital of Ukraine, also to other cities in the south and on the eastern part of Ukraine, but western part is still left just with some limited bombardment, including my native city of Lutsk, close to Poland. But in this case, I think the goal of Putin would be most important for Putin is to take control over Ukraine, or not entire Ukraine maybe, because Western Ukraine is always regarded as problematic for Russia because of history and because of this is a very anti-Russian region. So I don't think that Putin would be very interested to take in control over Western Ukraine, in contrast to Eastern Ukraine and Central Ukraine, and also he would be interested in taking control over Kyiv in order to change government. So this is basically Putin, I think, has a number of different aims in Ukraine, in particular to defeat Ukraine militarily and take control over a large part of Ukraine, including southern Ukraine and eastern Ukraine and Kyiv city, in order to also change government of Ukraine into from pro-Western government, which is client state of the United States, into government which would be pro-Russian and basically client state of Russia, and would follow Russia in domestic and foreign policies. And this would enable also Russia to kind of achieve demilitarization of Ukraine, which was goal of Putin, and also implement his kind of policy of so-called denazification, which basically would mean that Russia would resort to kind of try to persecute and go after neo-Nazi and kind of radical nationalist organizations in Ukraine and their military formations. And I don't think that the goal of Russia is occupation of entire Ukraine, including Western Ukraine. I think they would achieve their goal by installing their pro-Russian government in Kyiv, which could be done now quite relatively fast, and unless there would be any kind of something unexpected happen, because Russia has much more important advantage over Ukraine militarily, and a lot of Ukrainians would switch their orientation based on kind of rational calculation, and this can lead to such kind of regime change in Ukraine, and to kind of maybe also there is possibilities that Putin would try to turn Ukraine into confederation, for instance, by Putin giving more autonomy to eastern and southern Ukraine regions of Ukraine, which he called Novorossiya or New Russia, and he also might have using option even to install former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who was kind of deposed after Maidan Massacre, as kind of interim leader of Ukraine, in order to give legitimacy to give certain kind of legitimacy to this new government, which would be pro-Russian, and then would kind of pursue policies which would be friendly to Russia, and this is, I think, would achieve all other goals like demilitarization of Ukraine, and also policies against far-right formations and so on. Even so, this would be very costly to Russia, but I also said that sanctions would have no effect on decision by Putin in this regard, and his use of military force, because for Russia, Ukraine is considered to be a crucial issue, and that's why we have this conflict right now taking place at such a very dangerous level, and this will be, I think, very negative for Ukraine and for many Ukrainians, because war always is kind of much worse than peace. Even bad peace is better than a good war or any kind of war, and I don't think this is war is justified by Russia, because Putin claims that there is a genocide of Russian-speaking population or ethnic Russians in Ukraine, and this is not the case. And also, he claimed that basically there is a Nazi government, or Nazi kind of Ukraine is kind of basically run by the Nazis. This is not also the case. Far-right are influential, but there is no kind of Nazi government, and no such system which is kind of Nazi system or neo-Nazi system in Ukraine, even so far-right is important. So in this case, I think that Putin also used such false claims in order to justify his actions. And in any case, this would be kind of very dangerous also for the future of Ukraine, because kind of now this is, I think, a very big tragedy for Ukraine, which could have been easily prevented if people and politicians, in particular in different countries in Ukraine, Russia, and the West, try to reach a peaceful resolution. But this is unfortunately now is too late.
Well, Professor Katchanovski, thank you so much for joining us here in the Freedom Side and giving us some of your perspectives.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's just go ahead and keep moving here. You got a packed show.
Chugging along.
Listen, well, you know, we're trying to get a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different perspectives here.
Yes.
Obviously, there are a lot of complicated issues and complicated positions amongst our own friends and supporters. So we're trying to give you the broadest based piece that we can from all across the world. And on that point, we are very happy to welcome Ben Chacko, who is a journalist and the editor of the Morning Star newspaper in the United Kingdom. Ben, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I guess my first question for you, in a way, is you know, how did we get here? What exactly are we looking at here? I mean, obviously, we've seen 30 years of NATO aggression, you know, enemy politics towards Russia, attempts to isolate and surround the country. There's a lot of different internal politics in Ukraine and Russia. You know, we've even had some folks here say that they think this is a clash of two imperialisms. I certainly don't agree with that. I would say it's a clash between imperialism and a capitalist state trying to expand its role in the world. But a lot of complicated issues, and I don't even know, there's no real question there. But I guess, how did we get here, Ben, and what is the nature of this conflict?
Well, I think we should start by saying that the huge escalation that we've seen today is completely awful for the people of Ukraine. The massive Russian military invasion. Obviously, there's been a conflict bubbling away in the Donbass for 7 years. It's not been a minor conflict. Thousands and thousands of people have been killed. So this didn't all begin recently. But Putin's claim to, a few days ago that this was about protecting people in the Donbass from a Ukrainian attack, I think that is definitely been shown up to be a euphemism, considering that Russian troops have gone way beyond that area. They've gone right, going for Kiev, going right across Ukraine. So I think we should be very, very clear that this is, not an acceptable action by Russia, and there are protests emerging in Moscow and St. Petersburg tonight against what the Russian military are doing in Ukraine. But as you say, there are roots to what's happening here, which do go back some time. Russia has been treated with contempt, I would say, by the United States since the 1990s, and we know that there were the promises that NATO would not expand eastwards in 1989, which were all broken. Russia has repeatedly expressed its anger and concern about this situation. And all of those concerns have been effectively dismissed. And we saw that just before Christmas when Russia said, well, can we agree a mutual, de-escalation? We won't nuclear missiles in borders to the United States, and the United States wouldn't even consider it. So while I think we should condemn the Russian attacks on Ukraine today, we need to understand two things. One is that Russian aggression is the response of a country that's been poked effectively by the West, because the West has treated it as a country that can't hit back. And that's what Putin's reacting against. And secondly, that where is this doctrine? Where have we seen it before, that you can violate national borders because you want to protect some minority in another country? Well, it's been the West's doctrine since the end of the 1990s. It's exactly what happened in Yugoslavia, when very disputed claims of an ethnic cleansing operation against the Kosovar people was used by NATO effectively to break up Yugoslavia. And we've seen that repeatedly. We've seen the violation of international law in Afghanistan, in Iran, Libya, where security resolution was obtained basically under false pretenses, where the West said, well, we're going to impose a no-fly zone. And Russia and China voted for it. They both made clear afterwards that they were calm, that they did not mean they wanted NATO aircraft to be able to bomb Libya at will, which is what happened. So I think that Putin has learned from the West this doctrine that if you can get away with arbitrarily altering borders, then you can do it. And I think if we're looking at this as socialists, we need to look at what Putin said in his speech justifying the attack. I mean, he uses a lot of reactionary tropes here. He talks about how Ukraine was an invention of the Bolshevik government in the 1920s, and that's a kind of warped reference to the way that the Bolshevik government was probably the first Russian government to try and define national rights and national borders. So before then, you wouldn't have had a precise area of the Russian Empire that was definitively called Ukraine. But of course, Ukraine did exist. We know there were Ukrainian states in the Russian Civil War that were pretty nasty right-wing states. But Putin talks a lot about how, well, there was no consent to the creation of Ukraine in the 20s. And that, to me, is quite worrying. That suggests that there may be a major redrawing of the map by Russian forces now that they're in Ukraine. And to pick up on something that previous speaker was saying, I mean, yes, it may be very easy for Russia to swap in an anti-Russian for a pro-Russian government in Kiev. More or less what the West did in 2014, let's not forget. Ukraine has swung between pro-Western and pro-Russian governments ever since 1991. But at the same time, Zelensky, the current Ukrainian president, was effectively elected on a pledge to sort the war in the Donbass, on an anti-pledge, actually. This is often not appreciated because Zelensky has not been able to carry out any of his program, really. I mean, he was elected condemning land privatization, condemning medical privatization, and saying that he would bring peace to the Donbass renegotiation with Russia. He hasn't been able to do that. He hasn't been able to do that because his Western sponsors won't let him. The EU's pushed for further land privatization in Ukraine. And he hasn't been able to do that because you have these armed neo-Nazis in the Donbass who are on the front line, who are not interested in peace. And I think that if Zelensky hasn't been able to do that, then the idea that a government imposed by Putin will necessarily be able to do that, I think we've got a recipe for the conflict we've seen in the Donbass now actually taking place over a much wider area, because I don't think the kind of far-right Ukrainian nationalists who the West has been arming are going to give up. There'll be a long guerrilla war going on. I don't think this is going to be good for Russia or Ukraine.
Yeah, it seems to me that just looking at the way that the Western leaders have reacted so far, in particular, we saw Boris Johnson speak out today about sanctions and strangling Russia, as well as Joe Biden spoke couple hours ago, essentially announcing the same thing, this huge sanctions package against Russia. And I just want to quote exactly something that Joe Biden said that really struck me. And it was, Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. So to me, that suggests openly an act of collective punishment. I mean, say what you want about what the Russian government has done in Ukraine, but we have these leaders of countries that have destroyed so many countries around the world. I mean, the list is too long. I think we'd have to devote the rest of the episode listing the years and countries that the US and, oh God, don't even get me started on the UK, have destroyed around the world. But and just watching the gaggle of reporters after this speech that Joe Biden gave, their response was in typical fashion, why aren't you doing more? Why isn't there a military response? Why aren't you going further to strangle Russians and make them starve? And so I guess I raised this just to first to make a comment is, it's been shocking to me to see almost across the political spectrum, at least speaking of people who are in power, there's no opposition to sanctions, which is economic warfare against Russia, a massive country. I know people in Russia, they're going to be impacted by the destruction of their economy. And I know Russia's saying it's going to be immune from this, but I don't actually think that's true. But it just strikes me as so wrong that even some progressives in the West are getting behind this and saying we don't have enough sanctions, we need more, this is how we should respond. Because, when I think about what the US has done, just thinking of the Iraq War, which I think has been the biggest crime of the century, not even getting into all the other wars that the US is still involved in now, but just the Iraq War. I mean, if the world had responded to Americans by sanctioning them and lowering their standard of living, I don't think you'd see this response, this pro-sanctions response from Americans. And I don't even mean to compare what's happening in Ukraine to Iraq, because it's not even close at this point. I mean, Iraq was such a massive crime. But I guess my question for you is, what's the public, where you are, what's the public response? Is there a left response that's opposed to NATO, opposed to sanctions, or do you see a climate of almost making that seem like treason? Because that's what I see happening in the US. And then in the US political spectrum, you see progressive politicians like AOC say, I don't hear anything about NATO. I don't hear anything against sanctions. Quite the opposite.
I think you raised some really important points there. I mean, I think that one of them is that question of escalation and military responses. There's a kind of culture of belligerence in the media and in our political classes in Britain and in the United States, which is always seeking to up the ante. That's actually, ironically, what's brought us to this point. If we hadn't had this reckless confrontational approach for so long, if there'd been any effort to negotiate them, to enforce the Minsk agreements over the Donbass, for example, we would not be seeing the situation that we're seeing in Ukraine today. And you've got people calling for things, again, like the Libyan example, the no-fly zone. It sounds very innocent. What you're actually calling for, if you say we want a no-fly zone over Ukraine, is you're saying shoot down Russian aircraft. Now, that is a recipe to begin a war with a nuclear-armed state. That could obviously have extremely drastic consequences for the future of the human race itself. So, to be really clear, that military escalation is not an option here. When you say sanctions, I think as well, it's this bellicosity, this idea that we can punish the Russians, which has pushed them into this very, Putin's regime, into this mentality of aggression. I don't think it will work in terms of isolating Russia either. What you have seen is a geopolitical reordering in recent months because of the relentless US attacks on China and Russia simultaneously. It's almost like there was an article in the Morning Star earlier this week in which one of our contributors said, well, Kissinger, he's not dead yet, but if he was, he'd be turning in his grave, because his great geopolitical principle was you separate Russia and China, you keep them as rivals to each other, and that's what Nixon did in the 1970s. But because America's tried to enforce its will everywhere, you've now got Russia and China effectively in the same, and China's already today that it would make up with various trade arrangements for any economic harm done to Russia by EU and US sanctions. So I don't think it will work in terms of the punishment of Russia. I don't think it helps de-escalate the situation. And that brings us on to your final point, really, about this idea of treason. There is a strong anti-war movement in Britain. The Stop the War Coalition, its greatest achievement was in the time of the war in Iraq, when it organised the biggest protest in British political history, a march of 2 million people through London. It did change British politics. Its influence was one of the reasons why MPs voted against war in Syria in 2013. And it's sometimes associated with being one of the movements that gave birth to the Corbyn movement in Britain, was the Stop the War Coalition. Now, much more recently than that, a poll of Labour Party members last year, Stop the War Coalition to be the most organisation among Labour Party members. So this is a big popular peace movement. And all polling before today's events, which I think we don't know how that's going to affect this situation, but all the polling recently has shown that British people do not want to get involved in what they saw as a quarrel between Russia and Ukraine. But we've got, possibly because of that legacy, because of the Corbyn movement as well, and the scare that Jeremy Corbyn gave to the British establishment for 5 years, we've got a real concerted effort now to say the Stop the War Coalition are a fifth column. That term was used on the London Broadcasting Corporation radio station the other day. There's been repeated attacks from all sides of Parliament on Stop the War Coalition. The coalition put out a statement today which condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also pointed to the role of NATO in driving up these tensions. 11 Labour MPs signed it, and they were threatened that the Labour whip said they would not use the Labour if they did not withdraw their signatures. Now, all of them have withdrawn their signatures under that threat. Many of these campaigners I know who are left-wing socialists, that's why they signed the statement in the first place. But I think it's very, very worrying that, even a statement which did condemn the invasion, because it didn't give complete 100% support to NATO, was considered to be beyond the pale. And you've now got the Labour Party threatening MPs, saying if you sign this, then you're not in our party anymore. That's really worrying, and we really need to resist it.
No, I think that's a very well taken point, and I think, Rania, what you're saying about the atmosphere is so true. Ben Chacko, journalist and editor of the Morning Star, really appreciate you joining us again here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, why don't we just move to our next guest if we can? I think that they may be available and ready to start, and then, we certainly can say many things. I mean, there's so many things to say about this entire situation. We'd be here all week on nonstop. But that being said, very happy to be joined here by Richard Becker, who is a national organizer with the Answer Coalition. Richard, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Answer Coalition is certainly a venerable name in the U.S. anti-war movement. I'm curious your thoughts and what Answer is saying in terms of not only the nature of this conflict, but for people here in the United States, how they should be relating to what is maybe not troops on the battlefront, but clearly an escalation from President Biden vis-a-vis sanctions and other measures.
Well, I would say to start with that, it's very regrettable to see another war. And we know, that the consequences, there will be bad consequences for people from the war, maybe on both sides. We have no idea. This is the very beginning. But we really have to address ourselves here in the United States to why is this happening? Why is this war happening? And those responsible for this war, above all and fundamentally, are the U.S. and NATO. And they have pushed. And, I wanted to make a connection between your earlier speaker who was talking about Maidan and what happened then and the present, 2014 and 2022. 2014 and in the years leading up to it, we had the Obama-Biden, and in the first term, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State. That was the regime. And that regime continued on. It was there. Victoria Nuland, Hillary Clinton's protege, was there in the Maidan, and really the organizer of the overthrow of the government and the replacement at that time. And then we see this whole crew is back.
the whole crew. Jake Sullivan is the national security advisor, and Kurt Campbell in charge of China, and Victoria Nuland, Undersecretary of State, and then Biden, who's had the portfolio of Ukraine back in 2014 and 2015. So here's a group that came back in. They overreached, I believe, in 2014. They thought that overthrowing the government at that time would lead to the complete takeover and integrating Ukraine into NATO and taking over Crimea and all that. And of course, the Russian government couldn't accept that. And it's not just the government of Putin that couldn't accept that. Whether the head of the leader of the government in Russia was named Lenin or Stalin or Khrushchev or Putin, none of them could accept that. None of them could accept that idea of what was going to happen. So they pushed back. But the U.S. hasn't given up. So now we have the same crew back in with the same obvious intentions of sealing the rest of the border on the European side with Russia, with NATO base and NATO member states, NATO bases, and they can't accept it. So there was a buildup to this, and one of your earlier speakers said that the West treats and the U.S. treats Russia with contempt. They treated them with total contempt. There was no to everything that Russia proposed. And that led to, a situation where I believe that the Russian government had to decide whether to capitulate or to do something else. I think we were surprised, and I have to say that, surprised by the fact that war broke out in the way that it did. But if you look at the situation, and if you look at what brought this about, and also I just wanted to say there was a couple of the guests earlier said there are two imperialist countries. I think that's a wrong way to frame this. It's not the U.S. that's being surrounded by Russia while NATO surrounds Russia. No, nothing like that is happening. It's a capitalist country. We know that. It's not a socialist country anymore, but it's the target. And this is part of what the real U.S. global strategy is, which is a strategy of global domination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that it's so important to talk about this language because right now I think there's a lot of confusion, particularly on the US left, of how to feel about what's happening. Because obviously we don't want war, right? War should be avoided at all costs because it's brutal, it's horrible, people are killed, societies are totally shattered by war, refugees are, people become refugees. It's horrible. So we want to avoid it at all costs, and we want to be angry at whoever starts a war. But that said, I think there's also, in addition to this sort of confusion and not really understanding, like what Eugene was saying earlier, the media is kind of starting 2 days ago or a week ago, and no one really has the full context of Russia being encircled for the last 20 years and more, countries added to NATO and whatnot. But on top of all of that, there's also this climate of, I think, real bullying and fear of speaking out in any way that will have you framed as being like pro-Russia or pro-Kremlin or pro-Putin. And so I don't know, can you speak a little bit to that? Because this is something that we see happening in a lot of escalations when it comes to war involving the US, is we see this climate of fear around being able to just speak out against it because you're labeled as pro this person or that person, on top of all the confusion of what you should be supporting. So here, let me make it more clear. What should the leftist position be? And what is your advice for those who are afraid to be labeled a certain name by coming out against NATO or coming out against further US escalation?
Well, I think that whenever this happens, whenever we see a crisis like this breaks out, the mass media becomes the state media. The big networks they all say the same thing. I mean, there might be slightly different verbiage, but it's all the same thing. And so it creates an atmosphere for people that they feel like, wow, can I really speak out? Especially for people who haven't been involved in this kind of thing before. But the only step that can really matter is for people to take action. People who have never taken action, they can't think of what it is or imagine what to do unless they see others doing it. So for those of us who understand imperialism, and we understand the aggressiveness, the extreme aggressiveness, and what really motivates U.S. foreign policy, and that it has nothing to do with what they talk about. And it has everything to do with global domination. And it has since a couple months after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the first documents came out that said, our main aim is to not allow any power to arise that can challenge us in the future. You can't be much plainer than that. And that has been incorporated over and over again. This isn't conspiracy theory. People can go look up the national security strategies or the national defense strategy and see yourself that who they see as the possible, those standing in the way of global domination in the future. And right now it's China and Russia. And so that's what's really motivating it. We have to explain that. We have to explain it. We have to explain it in writing in great programs like this. But we also have to explain it by being active in the streets, and so that people see that there's another side. There is an opposition. If there's no opposition, there's no pole of opposition, then there's no way for those who are concerned and who are anti-war and against the whole policy of competition and who want to be, if they never hear it, for a different kind of world, one based on friendship and solidarity and cooperation, rather than what we're confronted with. And that is what we're confronted with, because we hear Biden tells us we got to win the 21st century against China. Why? Who's that for? That's not for us. That's for corporate America and the military, industrial corporations and complex and so forth. But we have to take a stand. The only way to stop this will be a movement of the people that rejects war and intervention.
Yeah, no, very well taken points. And you all, of course, are at answercoalition.org. And it just seems to me that, almost in a way, Richard, it reminds me of sort of some of the things that many people have said about the last Cold War, that it really wasn't a Cold War, that it was actually a very hot war. And of course, from Vietnam to Angola, many people were killed. And it just seems like the stakes here going into the 21st century are very much, are we going to have another century of, Western instigated, essentially, division of the world into camps, wars breaking out of all types all over the place, and then now we have climate change laid over top of it, so if there's no cooperation there. I mean, I always hate to be the person who's, the house is on fire, but I mean, this almost does feel like an alarm bell, like an existential piece about where the world is headed if we're not careful.
Yeah, well, that's definitely the case. I mean, we will only not see that come, another century of war, if we take action. If the people's movement, and it needs to be a wider people's movement. Right now, today, it's very hard. It's very hard to call on people to come out, but we have to speak out and we have to organize. We have to organize against this whole idea that the aim of the people of the United States should be to rule the world. We don't want that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Richard Becker, Answer Coalition, answercoalition.org. Really appreciate you joining us and giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, that brings us to the end of our guest, not the end of our show, but obviously it was a little bit of a whirlwind there, and I don't actually apologize for that. I'd like to say that within reason we've had all the different viewpoints, like I said, within reason, on what took place here.
Well, we did not give Adam Schiff his chance to
That's
come
true.
on our show.
He's outside of reason.
I mean,
there's no doubt about it.
Yeah, that's why.
Yeah,
just wanted to clarify that.
There's a lot of things that can be said. I mean, and you said this, I think, a little bit ago. I mean, obviously, peace is always preferable to war. Yvonne, who we had on earlier, made this point, that a bad peace is better than any war. Peace is always preferable. But I think that what many people have pointed out throughout our show today, which I think is necessary to discuss here, is that the precondition for peace in Europe is not present because of NATO and because of enemy politics. I mean, as long as you had a
Exactly.
offensive military alliance aimed against another European country, and yes, Russia does span Europe and Asia, but it is a European country. There's a lot of intercourse between these two parts of Europe, so-called Western Europe, Eastern Europe, going back over 1,000 years. And obviously there are a lot of both positive and negative elements of that history. There are different views on that. But to have any form of peace, it requires a collective discussion where everyone's interests, to some degree, are taken into account. But we have NATO, which has refused to take into account any Russian grievances or issues, no matter how well-founded, from a historical basis. I mean, from the very beginning, we've seen this from the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and it should be noted that this was, to some degree, tied to the broader issue of German reunification, changes in Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, that we were going to, not we, I wasn't there, but, you know, that this whole Cold War alliance system was going to be breaking apart, and there would be, you know, it has many different names. The one that everyone's throwing around now that comes from, I think, the 1999 OSCE meeting, the Indivisible Europe, but that never happened. Under the guise of cooperation for the first half of the 90s, the U.S. essentially tricked Russia. In 1997, when they signed their first agreement, they signed on to things that they obviously had no desire to do. Every enlargement of NATO has been predicated on Russia as the enemy. So, you know, to me, the real tragedy is the people of the Ukraine the people of Ukraine never should have had to choose between Europe and Russia. I mean, based on where they are, the history, you should be able to work on both sides. But obviously that does require consideration of the fact that there are competing and clashing claims. And, you know, the U.S. has rubbished at every turning point the idea of Russian security concerns, which to me is outrageous, given the history of the country, you know, World War I, especially World War II, of course, you know, where millions of people died in Ukraine and Russia and the former Soviet republics, 27 million people all told, 15 million in Russia. We can go all the way back to Napoleon. There's obviously a long history of people saying Russia is an enemy or a competitor and then invading the country and killing a very large number of people.
And
So
using Ukraine to invade it, by the way.
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
using
Ukraine
the-
and Belarus, the Western marches. So ultimately, that is legitimate. But by the U.S. saying that's totally illegitimate, that it doesn't matter at all, that there's nothing there, that's not diplomacy. That's just making a number of demands that you're demanding that a country acquiesce to. So, you know, it's hard because the way people want to talk about it is, are you for it or are you against it? Are you for Putin going in or are you against it? Is this good or is it bad? And, you know, it's one of those sort of binary questions where it's difficult because you're in a situation where you have 30 years of essentially painting Russia into a corner. Just about everyone who's following this knew that eventually it could go too far and that the possibility of Russia pushing back in some way, who knows how, was only growing by the day. And so when you reach the day where it happens, there's such a temptation to say, well, the perpetrator, quote unquote, we all have to pile on that person without a thought process of, well, how did we even get here? And I think where we are now, you know, and you know, from my perspective, it's why I feel like I don't support what Russia did, but I don't quite condemn it either. Because, you know, at a certain point, what are you supposed to do when you've been completely cornered, surrounded, pushed up against a wall, and told that all of your concerns, no matter how historically well-founded, are total BS? Something's bound to happen. Now, I think as some of our guests have said, I find, you know, the attacks on Lenin and the Bolsheviks to be slanderous and to be false and to be in no way, shape, or form, you know, a predicate for war at all. And I think it's deeply unfortunate that those comments were made, and I hope people aren't taken in by that and that they study the real history of Soviet nationalities policy, which should be celebrated on the world scale when we're talking about how do we deal with ethnic differences. There's a lot to learn from the Soviet Union. I think that's clear from anyone who knows about it. But, you know, on top of that, you know, there's a lot of complicated issues that are involved. And so it's tough. But if we don't consider the basic fact that the only off-ramp is the dissolution of NATO. And I know now it might say, why are you saying that now? How are you saying that now? But the reality is NATO is not a defensive alliance, it's an offensive alliance. And the fact that it exists is what brought us to this point in the first place. And unless you can have a Europe from Ireland to the Urals, where we're considering everyone's, you know, views and thoughts and fears and concerns, and also hopes and dreams for how they can come together and live in peace, you'll never be able to have that kind of dispensation. And I'm just concerned that we have moved to a point of permanent escalation, sanctions, which are a form of war, which means the average everyday Russian, no matter how they feel about what their government has done, is probably going to suffer. The people all around the world, especially Africa, will now suffer because of the increase of wheat futures and
the Middle
commodity
East.
prices.
And the Middle East.
The Middle East.
The Middle East is a
People in the United
huge,
States.
Russia's,
I mean,
Yeah.
it's going to deeply affect the world, and it's going to affect average everyday people. And you've got Biden and others using this as an excuse to only push things further to say, again, there are no legitimate concerns. This shows Russia has no legitimate concerns. They're just evil people and want to take over the world. And it feels that the idea of a possibility of getting off this terrible ride is going in a different direction unless people stand up and say we have to do something different than the way we did it for 30 years because that's how we ended up here, in the first place. And it's a tragic, terrible situation. But I hate to say it was inevitable because it wasn't inevitable. People could have done something. But without a change in policy, it was inevitable.
Yeah, it was. And the U.S. knew it was inevitable. Putin repeatedly said, the Russians repeatedly said, these are our security demands. And the U.S. kept dismissing them and refusing to even compromise a teeny bit, even though the U.S., all these U.S. elites keep saying, well, we never intended for Ukraine to be in NATO in anyways, but they just wouldn't say it to Russia. But, I've been reading a lot of mainstream media coverage, partly because I hate myself, but partly because I want to see, this is how the ruling class views this. And I want to see, is there any reflecting? Because what Russia did is being framed by the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN as the antics of a madman. I even read a New York Times piece saying that in recent months, Putin has isolated himself so much that he's crazier than Stalin. That is literally how they're viewing this. They're not viewing it through the lens of, okay, Putin has historically been you say what you want about him. He's been a fairly pragmatic and strategic actor, right? He doesn't just lash out and do things without calculation. And so you have to step back. You would think this would be a moment to step back and think, okay, what was the calculation here? And I think that's what a lot of us are asking today, because I think a lot of us, myself included, either went to bed last night or woke up today, depending what time zone we're in, thinking, holy crap, I didn't expect this. What's the calculation? And aside from condemn it or not condemn it, I think there is a logic to what the Russians have done, right? They've taken this crisis, they were backed into a corner, and they've pushed it further. They're using what they think is their leverage, and they've moved forward with this invasion bombing campaign, whatever, which they must have had ready to go on some level of planning for some time. And in the meantime, ahead of this, they've strengthened their reserves, not in dollars, so that they could withstand what they knew would eventually be. Russia knew that inevitably they've decided that the West is never going to be their friend. They are always going to treat them as an enemy. And therefore, they've prepared the groundwork for these inevitable sanctions that they saw coming, which are coming now. So they strengthened their reserve. So they've found a Chinese client for their gas, right, in case they lose their European customer. Transferred more of their fleet to the Syrian coast so that sanctions basically won't harm them as much. And I actually think sanctions will still harm Russia quite a lot, but less than had they been implemented this way 5 years ago, right? And at the end of the day, what we're witnessing is that the U.S. can't do anything about it. It's another example of the U.S. making false promises to one of its local allies, whether it's Afghanistan or whether it's Ukraine. They've made these promises that they're not following through on and basically abandoning them, because that's what Americans do. They abandon their allies. And this is another example of that. I'm sure other people who are allied with the Americans after seeing what happened in Afghanistan are also watching this play out and wondering, are they really not going to do anything for the Ukrainians? And I don't think they are, other than talk. And then, Europeans can't handle a major war so close to home and with all the refugees that'll bring. So I really don't see the Europeans getting so involved either, aside from all the rhetoric and strengthening their defenses around various parts of Europe where NATO already exists. And I know the Germans did cancel Nord Stream 2, but there's still Nord Stream 1, right? So at the end of the day, I think what this is proving, and I imagine this is also probably an intention of the Russians, is that it's proving a weakness in NATO that I don't even think NATO realizes. And maybe I'm wrong to say that, but that is what it looks like so far. A weakness in NATO, a weakness in the ability of the West to react, because they're just standing back as Russia is completely degrading Ukraine's military infrastructure. And so, of course, Russia, they could end up getting bogged down in like a prolonged insurgency in Ukraine. That could work out well for the Russians and halt the threat against them. It could work out terribly for the Russians. And also, no matter what, it's going to work out pretty terribly for the Ukrainians. And I'm just being super realistic here. This isn't about putting blame, but then to bring it to that, regardless of the outcome, I do think that the reason that you see such a freak out isn't just that Russia is bombing Ukraine, right? Because there's countries getting bombed all the time. It's also that Russia's bombing Ukraine and there's almost nothing the West can do to stop it. And I think that's freaking them out because it speaks to this great power competition, to the fact that we're moving towards a world where, yes, America still dominates, but clearly it's in a very weakened position. And I think that's why you're seeing such a huge freak out. And I think this is a good time to segue to a tweet that I want to show. And I want to get your reaction to it. And this is, I think we showed a tweet from her last week, but she is our old friend, Julia Yaffe. The tweet is, she keeps on, gift that keeps on giving. So she says, this is one of the fundamental differences between American and Russian political culture. As much as the American system gets shit for being pro-war, it's actually allergic to the thing, thus the drone wars. The Russian system is not scared of war. It welcomes it. And before you give me your reaction, Eugene, I just want to say how completely offensive this view is, because it wasn't just coming from her, but she really, was emblematic of it. This view that America doesn't do wars, but Russia does and doesn't care. Like, America's occupying Syria. It's occupying Iraq still. It's helping starve and bomb Yemen. It just bombed Somalia. AFRICOM's expanding. Like, what are you talking about? I'm in a region of the world where I see the US and its meddling and its wars everywhere. Like, I invite you, Julia Yaffe, to please come take a tour of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen. And that's just the Middle East. I mean, we can also do Latin America. We can also do East Asia. We can also do Africa. Like, what drug are these people on? Anyways, but Eugene, I'm wondering what you think about this idea that Americans are allergic to war, but Russians love it.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think those kind of like weird genetic things about, Russians and Americans in and of itself is a big problem. And I think I remember Julia Yaffe at one point criticizing that kind of pathologizing of whole peoples like that when she was trying to make a different point about Russians. But I won't go there. But the point being, I think it's obviously absurd. I mean, the point is well taken that, obviously things like drones, the embedded media are all things that the U.S. military has learned from to tamp down opposition to wars in the United States. I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that there are many people in this country who are deeply opposed to war, militarism, intervention, and so on and so forth. But there are also a lot of people who are for war. And quite frankly, just about every single politician is amongst that group of people. In fact, if we're talking about American political culture, I think the real thing that's worth noting is how every single politician is constantly for almost every war, even though there's never a concomitant level of support for those wars amongst the population writ large. So the real question about American political culture is how the country is just bludgeoned by its politicians and its media into supporting these wars that people are often skeptical about. So that point's well taken. But I mean, obviously, when you look at the record, I mean, Russia has obviously, has just been involved in significantly fewer conflicts than the United States over, and I don't even know what period she's talking, but I mean, if we want to go back to the Soviet period, a lot of the wars that they were involved in they should have been involved in. I mean, Angola and defeating the apartheid forces and their, handmaidens there, supporting the ANC against the apartheid government, which the U.S. government did not do. But even some of the things that always obviously happened in the 90s that I think have a lot of problems to them, things like Chechnya and things like that. I mean, you had U.S. doing Yugoslavia, Iraq twice. I mean, just any comparison, that doesn't make any sense to me. And it just shows how you can make these kind of fact-free claims. And since I think she has some Soviet or former Soviet ancestry, I believe, I don't know if it's Russian, but you can sort of weaponize that to say things like, oh, well, this is how people feel. But it's obviously an oversimplification, and it obviously plays into these sort of tropes that I think deny the fact that I think most people everywhere in every country prefer for there not to be wars. And quite frankly, I think what most people, if you ask them on the street, said, hey, could we just end all wars? I think most people would be very much in favor of that. So anyway, it's some of my thoughts about that.
Well, so in that case, speaking of politicians, there's another tweet I'd like to get your take
course.
on. It's by one of our favorites. And I'm not bringing this up just to trash AOC. I know everyone loves to trash AOC, but I think that this is important because it speaks to, she's probably one of the most left-wing, right, Congress people that we have.
And the most well-known left-wing congressperson,
Right.
quote unquote, on the world stage. So even beyond the American audience, I know this from traveling around the world, people do look at her statements as really representing sort of progressive people in the United States, quote unquote.
Exactly. And so here she is saying Russia's invasion of Ukraine is indefensible. The U.S. is right to impose targeted sanctions on Putin and his oligarchs. We also must work with our allies to prepare for a refugee crisis on a massive scale. Finally, any military action must take place with congressional approval. I mean, Eugene, there's so much wrong with this statement. I'm not, so whatever, the first sentence, fine. The invasion's indefensible. Okay. The U.S. is right to impose targeted sanctions on Putin and his oligarchs. I hate the term oligarchs when used in this case because it's always directed just towards Russians and never towards our oligarchs. We have so many that are way richer, like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. But fine, whatever. I'll let you have that to be generous. But the targeted sanctions, I can't accept. I can't accept that one of our most left-wing Congress people is okay with that kind of economic warfare, given the U.S. is imposing that economic warfare on so many countries. And we know, how many more studies do you need to show you that this is collective punishment against regular people? They're not targeted. But then finally, as she says, any military action must take place with congressional approval. And this is the most problematic part of the statement. I mean, this to me says that the problem isn't military action in and of itself, which, by the way, in this case would be military action against Russia, a nuclear-armed power. But the issue of Congress approving it is the problem, that we need to be able to approve it. I mean, if you actually had a resolution or a bill in Congress right now about whether to militarily escalate against Russia, I actually think it would pass with no problem. But I think this is a really terrible goalpost for the most left-wing member of Congress to have, nothing. And it just strikes me as a bigger problem because we don't have any members of Congress, as far as I can see, saying anything about NATO and its expansion and the danger of expanding NATO, or even acknowledging the U.S. role. It's just Putin bad, Russia bad, sanctions, congressional approval. Seriously?
Yeah.
What's your take?
No, I mean, this has really become, and I will blame Tim Kaine for this, actually. I mean, this, during the sort of latter half of the Obama administration became sort of the stalking horse inside of Congress for people who wanted to appear as if they were critical in some way, shape, or form of the war machine, but didn't want to actually criticize any of its actions. And so then you had this situation where you had a lot of people, and I mentioned Tim Kaine because he has been one of the main people really pushing this in Congress, that it made this whole deal about, well, we have to make sure that, you get congressional approval. And of course, this was there's the War Powers Act that was passed by Congress to, try to control Nixon vis-a-vis Vietnam, which, by the way, actually does allow the president to take action without congressional approval. You just have to go subsequently. You have to notify Congress within 48 hours. And then I think you have to get authorization, beyond 60 days or something like that. But anyway, so constitutionality aside, legality aside, it really, to me, is primarily a dodge. And the whole reason of laying it out by people in Congress is because it's a great way to look like you're going to do something without committing to do something, by saying oh, they have to come to us first, as if they're going to say no. But I think, as you say, they're almost always going to say yes. And they just want to be, they really want to just have their power recognized vis-a-vis the executive. So in some ways, I view it almost as institutional prerogative. It's not any form of progressive anti-war politics. It's turf protection, really, by Congress vis-a-vis the president, tired of looking like they did in Vietnam, like they did under Bush, like they did under Obama, looking totally impotent in the face of the executive power to wage wars that their constituents are saying, why are we doing this? So I think that's one. Two, yeah, I mean, whether you defend it or not, it obviously is defensible. It's just a question of whether or not you accept that defense. And I think to even use that phrasing just sort of plays into the broader sort of war fever. I mean, that's why I made the point earlier. I don't really support it, but I don't quite condemn it. Because when you look at the reality of what's going on, I mean, not only do I think there were false pretenses involved in terms of how the thing's even being pushed, I don't actually think that this pushes forward like the cause of the progressive movement worldwide. I think it raises a lot of troubling questions in terms of international relations. I mean, when you talk about multipolarity, the reason we have multipolarity is because of the interior collapse of U.S. unipolar hegemony and the fact that there is no system for shared democratic discussion between nations. It's just the U.S. telling everyone what to do. But that's totally untenable. So in the context where the U.S. is saying, well, we're just going to tell everyone what to do, we're going to have a rules-based international order where we make all the rules. Other countries that are becoming more powerful are saying, well, we're not going to accept that. Like, we have different views about not only what the rules should be, but what should be taking place even within the boundaries of the rules, which seem to not exist anyway because you just do whatever you want to do. So people are maneuvering and doing different things. And just like we've seen happen before, you know, World War I came out of a multipolar world. When you have a bunch of relatively evenly matched individuals and you've got, you know, one sort of central declining hegemon saying, do everything the way we want to do it, you know, it creates the point for friction and war all around every conflict line. And it means that people are going to push things to the maximum degree. And so you really have to say, I think when you look at sort of the broader situation that we're in right now and why I feel that, you know, the sort of push to just make these condemnatory, I think that's the word, statements, and why, even though I think it feels to many people insufficient to talk as we're talking about all the history and all the context, the reason why I think it is important to talk about the history and the context and not just have these immediate reactions is because the only way out of this is to recognize that the set of frictions that led to this conflict all are rooted in the idea of one country saying they can dominate all other countries and determine all of their positions. So, you know, that's why the Russians do have a defense that they've laid out. Now, whether you accept it or not is a different view, but we have to really recognize that the actions that have taken place here are not random. They're not out of nowhere. They were widely predictable. This is what people who are anti-war forces have been warning about for years. If you keep doing NATO east, 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 eventually something bad is going to happen. Eventually, Russia probably will do something, push back. Who knows how it's going to come or what it's going to be? But people have been saying this, you know, since the 1990s. And here we are in this situation. So to just blanket condemn it and act as if that has done something, I understand it, and I recognize why people want to do it. I absolutely recognize the troubling questions that have been raised by this. I certainly endorse what people have said vis-a-vis the issue of the rationale for it being, I think, ultimately spurious in many ways, but the context of it is very relevant. And quite frankly, at a certain point, nations are justified in doing something to push back against the U.S. saying everything is what we say. And if we don't like the way people push back, that should be an alarm bell and a reminder that we have to change the context in which the decisions are being made. And if you don't do that, you're never going to get anywhere. We're just going to go around and around on a hamster wheel of blaming people. It'll be like the Spider-Man meme. Everyone's pointing at everyone else for being evil, and nothing ever changes. We have to look at the context and change the facts on the ground if we want to try to have something happen here. So unfortunate to see the tweet from AOC. Also unfortunate to see the sanctions thing. Sanctions have never worked. There are no such things as targeted sanctions, especially in countries that have very heavy state role in the economy because of how that deals with international trade. Hypocritical for her. I mean, she signed on to Chuy Garcia's bill to lift the sanctions on Venezuela. So, you know, you read the text of that bill, you'd think you'd know a little bit more. But anyway, that's my thoughts on Julia Yaffe and AOC and our broader political environment here. But Rania.
Well, I have another. I'm sorry. I had to get your take on these tweets, and I think it's actually good in guiding this discussion because I think these are a lot of the kinds of ideas that we're all being bombarded with. But I want to show another one by another friend of the show, Eric Swalwell. Is that how you say his name? I think he briefly tried to run for president.
I think the Republicans say he's a Chinese spy, right?
Yeah, wait,
They
are
do,
you
they do.
serious?
Yeah, they do.
Wow, okay, well, he's doing a
it's
terrible
honestly
job.
actually racist towards Asians the way they've done it, but I guess he had a romantic interlude with a young woman who I guess was alleged to be a Chinese spy. I don't know if it was ever cleared, but that's
Or
like,
was
if
she
you look at
just
the Republican
Chinese? She was
propaganda,
probably
it's all
just.
about how he's a Chinese spy.
Well, she was probably just. He probably dated a Chinese woman, and they were like, "Oh, he's a Chinese spy," because that's
Yeah.
a thing that's happening. Is like
It's
blaming
it's
people for
actually
being Chinese
it's all
spies.
jokes aside, it's a big thing that's happening in California politics now because there are many Chinese and Chinese descended people in California. Of course, a number of them have worked for various Democrats, and many of them, of course, you know, they're Chinese people, they're Chinese American people, so they have various ties and engagement with the mainland, and that's been spuriously described in many ways as spy activity. But anyway, I'm getting us way off the point.
Terrible,
I hate Eric
terrible.
Swalwell. That's the
So
ultimate point.
he's he's 100% terrible. But so he's telling us Ukraine is being bombed, right? Then he goes on to say the largest invasion on our planet since World War II.
Ooh.
Republicans are rooting for the Russians, God be with Ukraine and democracy, yada yada. But just the largest invasion on our planet since World War II.
Yeah.
Like, objectively speaking, that is false. And the reason I wanted to show this tweet in particular, as dramatic as it is and ridiculous as it is this is the mentality of our ruling class in America right now. Is that they literally have erased all of the criminal invasions, bombings, assassinations, coup d'etats that the U.S. is responsible for since after World War II to now. Because that's the only way you could come to this conclusion, is if you just erased every decade in between the end of the 1940s and 2022.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I can't say it better than that. I mean, it's, read a book, buddy. But yeah, and honestly, in moments like this, you can say anything. Because as you said, the atmosphere is if you say anything peace-like, you're a traitor. So it opens up the space for people to just make these wild claims because no one's going to challenge you. I mean, I guess the Freedom Side Live will challenge you, but, by and large in the mainstream, they're not going to challenge you. But, anyway.
Well, I think a good point to end on, because you were speaking to this earlier, and I'd like to hear you finish your thought on this, because I think it deserves analysis that people can really digest right now, because we had a few guests. All of our guests were wonderful, of a variety of opinions, but we talked a little bit about it earlier, and I just want to get into a little bit more, is this idea of two imperialist powers fighting each other, like Russia and America. This is a pretty dominant idea on the sort of mainstream left in the West. And I think it really speaks to a lack of understanding of what imperialism means. And you were saying you were saying you see it as an imperialist country versus a capitalist country. And I'm wondering, for my own sake and a lot of those who are watching, could you expand on that a little bit? Because it's an idea that a lot of us are confronted with, that we know is wrong, but we're not quite sure why it's wrong to say this is a fight between two imperialist powers.
I think it's a very good point. I mean, one thing I can say in favor of Putin, at least he's brought Lenin back into the popular lexicon, who wrote quite a bit about this. Imperialism is created in space and time. It's obviously, and as Lenin famously said, the highest stage of capitalism. And when you read his understanding of it, in his explication of what it really is, the point he's laying out is that the division of the world between the great powers, the division and the redivision of the world between the great powers, is ultimately sort of the main global relationship of forces as it concerns imperialism. So you have the imperialist camp, which divides the world, amongst itself in many different ways, fights a number of wars over those divisions, and then you have after one of those wars, the emergence of the Soviet Union that upsets the apple cart, and then the world becomes divided after World War II in different ways. You have the imperialist camp, but then you have the socialist camp that is joined by a number of the anti-colonial movements and so on and so forth. And, fast forward to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you then have the unipolar imperialism of the United States. So you have a situation where the existing imperialist order is really collapsing in on itself in many different ways, through its own contradictions and its own overreach. And within that, and underneath that, you have a number of capitalist countries who were basically subordinated to the United States and who are tired of their subordination and are looking to find a role in the world they view to be more commensurate with their own prestige and power, desire to make money, and have their own commercial intercourse. But there's a reason why those countries aren't going all around the world with 900 military bases or whatever it is, and 1 million troops, and doing everything possible to determine what every single government everywhere on earth is going to do. Like, only the United States, and to a lesser extent Europe, really has that level of interference. Because there's a difference between wanting to expand your economic and commercial relations and chafing against those who are trying to stop you, and imperialism. And I think that when we look at imperialism purely as a set of one isolated thing. People say, well, Lenin said that imperialism means that a country's exporting capital. Aren't Russia and China exporting capital? You have to look at the totality of it. And the general point that he was making, which is that imperialism, again, is created in space and time. And it's not just a set of relationships in sort of the abstract sense. It's the actual concrete relationships that nation states have created. And the collapse of that order, the collapse of that imperialism is opening the space where, yes, perhaps at some point in the future, someone will try to emerge as sort of another imperial power. But I think right now what we have to look at it is the contradictions of imperialism and capitalism coming in on themselves, where the imperialist setup of finance capital is now fraying around the edges. Other people want to get into the game. The original imperialists don't want to let them in the game. They're trying to keep them out of the imperialist club and make sure they don't have any influence and make sure they're never at a level where they could change and become rivals at that point. If they're capitalist countries, that is. If they're socialist countries, they don't want them to rise at all for obvious reasons. So I think you can see when you put all that together that there's a big difference, I think, between sort of competing imperialisms like, France, Britain, whoever in World War I, and what we have now, where we don't really actually have a set of equally matched nations. What we have is one nation over top of all the other ones, and different people struggling for their own foothold here, there, and everywhere, chafing against imperialism, which wants to keep them out of the club at all costs. So I wasn't really ready for that question, so sorry for that.
Yeah, I'm sorry I threw that at you, but that
that's
was
my
really
general
well
view of it.
said. No, I think that's really well said, and I think it's an important thing to reflect on, as I keep seeing people over and over state this. And I think at that point, I'm really happy we got to do this program, because I feel like it's sorely needed. Everywhere I'm looking is just war fever, war fever, war fever. And I think it's a good time to remind people who are watching that you can support the Breakthrough News, you can support the Freedom Side and all our other excellent programming, from my show Dispatches to Eugene's Punch Out to the Socialist Program, by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news, becoming a patron. Or you can correct me if I'm wrong, Eugene, but you can also go to breakthroughnews.org and donate one-time donation directly there. Thank you to all of our super chatters who threw in money throughout this. I apologize that we didn't get to read your comments on air, but we did see them, and we do thank you. Yeah, a lot happening. And yeah, I'll leave it to you, Eugene, to take it from there.
You said it all. I think that's pretty much it. Obviously, we're going to continue to track this as we always do, and we try to bring you what we can when we can to help keep you informed on this. So follow us at BT Newsroom on all your social media platforms, youtube.com/breakthrough news, and we will see you next week.